On this episode of the Pax Romana podcast, I'm going to answer a question that I get often, sometimes in class. I've had a few listeners ask me as well, and that is, who is my favorite emperor? I don't actually think there are all that many to choose from. Rome's emperors were complicated figures. Often we have an idealized picture of their character and their accomplishments. And I'm not pretending that my favorite emperor is really the best person or the most moral actor. But after studying the Roman Empire for many, many years now, I've just found myself appreciating one emperor a little bit more than some of the others. This was an emperor who did not reign for the longest. He did not earn the position purely by merit either. He had a pedigree that included previous emperors. But he was a unique individual, and I think he cared for the people of Rome and was wise enough to take pragmatic steps to leave the city a better place than it was when he took over. He also was a bit of an underdog, and like many people, kind of a sucker for that sort of thing. So which emperor am I talking about? We'll get right to it on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Questions and answers 8. Who is my favorite Roman emperor? All right, I'm not going to bury the lead too much. My favorite emperor is Claudius. I think he has a lot going for him. Claudius reigned for 13 years. It was not an easy period to be in charge. There were some pretty significant political challenges. And yet he made the most of them, solving crises, but also laying the groundwork for long-term solutions to problems that directly affected the broader Roman population. He did what he did also with only tepid support at best from the senatorial elite. Senators did not like him. They resented his disabilities. They also didn't like the fact that he bypassed them when he thought it made sense to do so. I think Claudius is a pretty unconventional emperor in a lot of ways, despite the fact that he comes from the Julio-Claudian pedigree. In practice, he ruled in ways which suggest an impressive degree of flexibility, willingness to try new things, and I think, above all, a sense that he did ultimately need to serve his people. Now, before I get into the reasons why I happen to like Claudius more than any other emperor, I'll mention that I go through the background information on this emperor in episodes 13, 14, 15, and 16. So there's plenty of material already on Claudius from this podcast, which you can check out. I'm not going to rehash that material entirely. What I'm going to do instead is just give my reasons why he happens to be my favorite. And again, I'm not saying that he's the best emperor or that he's the most moral emperor or anything like that. It's just why I happen to like the guy. I think he seems like an interesting person and a thoughtful emperor. So the first thing that I'll just mention is it's pretty impressive that he was able to survive the purge of the House of Caligula, his nephew, in AD 41. Again, I detail this on previous episodes, but Caligula had only ruled for about 4 years. He was hated by just about everyone because he was an awful person. He was vengeful, murderous, violent, capricious, and the sources portray him even as a little bit mad. And when the Praetorian Guards decided to murder their own emperor, they marched through the imperial palace, killing a lot of other people as well. It looked like there was going to be a purge of the entire Julio-Claudian family. The way that the sources portray Claudius during this time is that he was just hiding behind a curtain in the palace, and the soldiers maybe had mercy on him and decided not to kill him. I don't know that that's true. When we look at Claudius's later actions as emperor, this is a guy that knew how to plan. He was also willing to take risks. And I just happen to think, and I don't have a lot of evidence for this, but I just happen to think that Claudius may very well have already arranged a kind of insurance policy for himself in the event that Caligula was murdered. I don't know. Maybe he even helped orchestrate Caligula's assassination. Who knows? But it can't be an accident that he was whisked away to the camp of the Praetorian Guards, where he was able to promise them a large sum of money and deliver that sum of money within the first year of his reign. Claudius really was a survivor, and we see this in this episode when he came to power. And I think one of the reasons Claudius was so good at snatching victory from the jaws of defeat was based on the way that he grew up. Claudius was an unlikely emperor in part because he was stigmatized for a variety of disabilities that he appears to have had. We don't know exactly what these were. He could not hear out of one ear. He had a limp. He seems to have not had complete control over his mouth and his voice. Ancient sources describe how he looked the part of an emperor, but as soon as he began to talk or walk or laugh, the charm immediately wore off. And for this reason, he was mocked ruthlessly by his family members, by members of the Senate, and ultimately by the ancient historians that preserve what we know of Claudius's reign. But we have to look through those criticisms. Claudius was not stupid. He was not an idiot. Many Romans thought he was, but he wasn't. We know, for example, that he attempted to reform the Latin language. He composed several books of history as well as an autobiography, and we don't have any of those to this day, but he did write them. And evidently they were somewhat critical of his own family members and the way that his family came to power, suggesting a man that was reflective, who was not afraid to ask questions, even if they led to uncomfortable answers. In a sense, I don't think Claudius really had much to lose. Nobody thought he was going to be emperor. He was marginalized for his disabilities. And I think when he obtained power, he may have seen it as an opportunity rather than an entitlement. And so he ruled in a way which was unconventional. And this really gets into the third reason that I just like Claudius and find him interesting. Instead of relying on members of the Senate, who had already shown disdain for him and were unlikely to ever really accept him as their emperor, he just decided to ignore them for the most part. Instead, he drew upon people whom he knew would get jobs done. These were former slaves, freedmen, and he effectively created Roman versions of what we might call government departments or secretariats, where he appointed individual freedmen to be in charge of a variety of aspects of imperial administration, things like communications and the treasury and administering the courts. The Senate, of course, hated this. Part of the deal for abolishing the Republic in the first place was that the senators would still be able to staff these high-status positions, that the emperors would rely on them for the practical business of government. But Claudius didn't do that. As far as he was concerned, the Senate would not do a very good job. They certainly didn't respect him, so instead he relied upon these freedmen. And although our sources, many of which were written by senators, describe these freedmen as taking advantage of Claudius, if we read between the lines, we don't really see evidence of that in practice. What we see are men that knew that they owed their positions to Claudius and were therefore loyal to him and willing to execute what he wanted them to do, and also who were pretty competent at what they did. The same is true, by the way, of the way that Claudius used women, in particular his wife Messalina. Now, there are lots of different views on her, and I go into detail on some of those views on episode 15, but I'll just go ahead and say here that I think that Claudius was using Messalina. It's nice to imagine Messalina as an assertive power player of a woman who used a combination of sex and wit and political acumen to effectively do what she wanted until finally the patriarchy of the Roman Republic caught up with her and executed her. I think that's a story that fits really well in modern society. I don't think that's really what happened. Claudius knew that members of the Senate would go after him, not just politically, but they might try to take his life. They wouldn't do it without having another option, however, so he was very sensitive to potential rivals, to men who were rising up in the Senate and looked like they might be able to engender support and lead a revolution against Claudius. Again, we have plenty of evidence that Claudius was not stupid. He would have been aware when one of these rivals was on the ascent. And I think this is where his wife Messalina came in. Messalina would sleep with these men. She may very well have been beautiful and alluring in her own right, but also she was the emperor's wife. And probably in combination with Claudius, Messalina executed a kind of thirst trap for these men, drawing them in with the allure not just of her body, but of the possibility of power. A relationship with Messalina could very well lead to the position of emperor itself. And so men had little choice but to sleep with her. Of course, if they didn't, they might find themselves at the wrong end of a vengeful woman. And what Claudius and Messalina did was very clever. Once she would sleep with these men, the rumors would make their way to Claudius. He would have the men executed, but Messalina he would leave alive. This, to me, only makes sense if Claudius was in on the scheme. If Messalina is just some independent agent doing what she wants, Claudius would have had her executed. Claudius had no problem having his freedmen executed that did not show sufficient obedience to his wishes. And I have no doubt that he would have executed Messalina. Eventually he did, by the way. The fact that he lets her live shows to me that this was a scheme. And once Messalina apparently turned on him, which she did in AD 48, then she died. Now, this is one of the more immoral activities that Claudius engaged in. He effectively pimped out his wife in order to preserve his hold on power. I'm not saying that I think Claudius is a moral emperor, but this was a level of 4D chess that no other emperor, to my knowledge, ever even thought of. In a sense, Claudius was playing the part. It's like Columbo, the detective that pretended to be a complete moron until at the end of the episode he would say, just one more thing. And it suddenly became clear that he knew what he was doing the entire time. I think Claudius was a lot like that. And it is best illustrated in the way that he used his wife, Messalina. But Claudius also had a pretty grand vision for the Roman Empire. He was ultimately successful at foreign policy. Claudius was able to annex Britain, the region of Thrace. He completed the annexation of Judea. Now, Claudius himself didn't personally lead the soldiers or diplomats that achieved these foreign policy victories, but he was a kind of leader that was able to cast a vision for an expanded Roman Empire, deploy the right men to the right positions, and ultimately achieve concrete results in each of those cases. Julius Caesar was not even able to conquer Britain, and yet Claudius was able to do it in just a few years. But regardless of the extent to which Claudius was personally responsible for these victories, he knew how to use them to obtain legitimacy. Claudius made much, for example, of the conquest of Britain, naming his son Britannicus. A frieze which survives to this day shows Claudius conquering Britain. He made sure that the conquest of Britain was advertised on coinage as well. All of this showcased his legitimacy as emperor, made his position more secure, and allowed him to do something that only the best Roman rulers were allowed to do, and that is to expand the sacred boundary of Rome. It's called the Palmarium. It was a boundary established by Rome's second king Numa and expanded only a few times in Roman history after a major extension of the Roman Empire. Claudius was able to secure such an extension as well, and so he was allowed to expand the Palmarium and secure his legacy as one of Rome's best emperors. But Claudius was not just about achieving foreign policy victories and using them for propaganda purposes. He practically made things better for people in Rome. There were grain shortages during Claudius's reign that appeared to have been caused by a variety of factors outside of his control. Storms on the sea that wrecked ships, droughts in key regions of the Roman Empire that produced grain, and ultimately inadequate infrastructure at Rome's major ports. Claudius took serious practical efforts to fix these problems. At the port of Ostia, he built a man-made island with a lighthouse, a canal, a one-way road system to accommodate ships. He appointed an equestrian procurator over the grain supply. He was even willing to ferry grain from North Africa during the stormy season. This was a high-risk move, but even the ancient sources, who are typically hostile to Claudius, mention how impressed they were that he was able to do this. Claudius also commissioned the construction of 2 aqueducts to bring water to the city of Rome. He passed laws that benefited slaves, requiring them to be treated more humanely. There are just a variety of practical measures that he took to make things better for common people in the city of Rome. The last thing I'll say about Claudius, and again, this is just kind of a personal thing that I kind of like about him, it's something that our elite sources use to deride Claudius, but I happen to like it, and that is his sense of humor. Claudius seems a little bit impulsive, maybe eccentric. He liked to play dice. He liked going to the races. He occasionally made awkward jokes, let his inner monologue become his outer monologue. I don't get the impression that Claudius was the most suave of speakers, but he apparently had a kind of charm to him that came from authenticity and just a willingness to speak his mind, to let people know the things that he found funny or ironic or odd. And I think it shows how Claudius, despite having this elite pedigree, which is of course very important, it allowed him to be emperor in the first place, was also at the same time a very human emperor. Now that's not to say his humor was always appropriate. He cracked jokes at wrong times. He made fun of people in ways that he probably ought not to have. He'd even decide court cases in ways which were kind of a joke to him, but were ultimately miscarriages of justice. Again, I'm not saying that Claudius had a perfect sense of humor, that he was Dave Chappelle or George Carlin. It sounds like he was a little bit more of a goofball. But again, I just find it a little bit endearing. Now, the inevitable question that comes to mind with all of this is, why didn't I pick a more traditional emperor? And certainly, I have some degree of admiration for emperors like Marcus Aurelius, who shows an impressive level of resiliency in the midst of an empire undergoing a lot of problems. Or somebody like Trajan, who was an impressive military figure, builder, and who seems to have had a real sense of how to govern an empire well. Even Augustus, in a lot of ways, is an impressive man, although I tend to think of him as a fairly devious person as well, a master of propaganda, a liar, and a murderer, but nevertheless, the fact that he was able to establish the Roman Principate and reign unmolested over people whom he had robbed of their freedom over the course of 40 plus years, that is pretty impressive as well. So those are great emperors for their own reasons. But the question was ultimately, who's my favorite? And I just have a little bit of a soft spot for Claudius. His ability to survive and thrive and take the Roman Empire with him, to improve the lives of people, to do so with a jovial spirit, while also being able to promote imperial ideology like the far more traditional, elite-minded emperors. All of that to me is impressive. So that is why Claudius is my favorite Roman emperor.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocor. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.